Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July meeting of the Exmoor National Park Authority. And we will start nearly on time. We are a little light on the ground with one or two members. I will start with apologies for absence, which I have so far. Linda Blanchard, Andrea Davis, Andy Milne, Fran Smith, Evelyn Stacey, and Susan Warren. Were there any others?
Possibly Penny Weather.
And possibly Penny. Move on to item 2. Any declarations of interest for items on the agenda? Members? Anyone? And no unaccompanied site visits. Right. Right. We'll come on to minutes in a minute. Announcements, as far as I didn't have any announcements of any note as far as I can tell. And we'll move on to item 4, minutes of the last meeting. First of all, to approve as a correct record. Can I have Vivian? Thank you. Can I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Jeremy. And all those in favour? That is everyone that was here, apart from those, of course, that weren't here. I thank John. And we'll move on as per normal. Any matters arising from those minutes? We'll head through page by page to start with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Hadn't better go on to page 9 because there isn't one. I do have a couple things to note there regarding the member appointments within the minutes. One was the Exmoor Local Access Forum. We checked the DEFRA publication guides on local access forum, and the regulations impose a limit on the number of local authority members. Forums with up to 16 members may contain 2 local authority members. 17 or more members contain up to 3. Exmoor Local Access Forum has a membership of 15, so only 2 member appointments for the Local Access Forum. Andy Milne volunteered to step down, so Dr. Susan Warren, Mrs. Penny Weber were appointed. Please.
That was really interesting. I thought it was open to the authority to increase the number of members to 17, in which case you could have 3.
Under the circumstances...
Fine not to, but I think it could have been got round if wanted.
I think, yes. What it does mean, though, just from a point of view from any members, just bear in mind anyone is able to attend a local access forum meeting. There are meetings that are open to any members of the public, and they are published. They're statutory meetings. So. And the FIPL assessment panel, 4 member representatives will be Mrs. Blanchard, Mr. Elston, myself, and Dr. Warren. Public speaking. We have some public speakers, I think, booked for the planning section, not for the authority section, so they're undoubtedly, Mr. Pugsley will take them in accordance with the items to which they're relevant to. We will move on to item 6, internal audit arrangements. To consider the report of the Chief Finance Officer. Gordon, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning. Yes, so item 6 of the agenda this morning is the report from Dominic Measures from the Devon Audit Partnership, who will talk you through the work they undertook in 21-22 and also the work they plan to do in this current financial year. He will also mention the audit charter and strategy, and he's presenting remotely, as you'll see. Thank you, Dominic. Sorry, Dominic, we'll just have to increase the volume one moment. We're just getting Mark, Dominic. He'll be back in 1 moment.
Yeah, don't want you to be silent throughout the your presentation. We'll sort that. While we're waiting for Mark to increase the volume a little bit, one item that I forgot to mention, I should have at the beginning, and I'm very reticent about doing so a lot of the time. Just a reminder to everyone on fire alarms and so on. You will notice if it goes off, it means that you leave immediately, leave everything behind. There's a fire escape door at the side of the committee room. It's that one there. And the assembly point is on the lawn at the front. Don't attempt to use the lift because you might remain in it. And do not attempt to re-enter any part of the building until advised so. So there, I have done that announcement just once to remind everyone. Please remember, members, and then I don't have to repeat it every time.
Thank you, Chair. I think we can start again. Do you want to start on again, Dominic? Sorry for that interruption.
Presented over a number of last few years, which is a requirement under the public sector internal audit standards and is stated in our audit charter and strategy that we'll go through in a short while. The report sets out the work that Devon Audit Partnership, as your internal auditors, has conducted during the 21-22 year, provides the Park Authority with an assurance opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of its internal control environment.
Sorry, Dominic, we've just got a bit of an echo here. Do you want to try again, Dominic?
Okay, is that any better? Shall I continue?
Please.
Okay. So as I was saying, we can provide you with an assurance opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of your internal control environment. Our work during the year comprised of 3 audits. Firstly, my auditors carried out their annual review of the authority's financial systems at the start of this calendar year. And once again, I've been able to give our highest level of assurance, namely substantial assurance, across all the different key financial systems listed in the table at paragraph 4.2 of my report. It is once again a credit to the Chief Finance Officer and his staff, especially in a year that saw continued challenges and demands, one which is still working remotely away from the office and each other at times. Our review did highlight one minor issue. This concerned the recording of staff absence and the subsequent return to work process, which in one instance was not carried out in what we felt was a timely manner. This, I stress, is a very minor point in the grand scheme of things and it has been addressed by officers. It is our normal practice to conduct follow-up reviews of audits where we've been unable to give a good level of assurance. So in addition to our work on key financial systems, last year's audit plan included a follow-up review of the arrangements in place regarding climate change, so that we checked on the progress with implementing the agreed recommendations arising from our review conducted in 2021. I'm pleased to report that we found good progress had been made in implementing the recommendations from that original report and that all but one had been completed. Section 4.7 of my report sets out these. However, the Park Authority cannot, as it's still much to do and challenges to face in order to meet a net zero target by 2030. And as ever, a lot of this comes down to adequate funding, which we, as your internal auditors, recognise. One significant area of risk, not just to yourselves, but to many other organisations across all sectors, is the global cyber threat and the impact it can have on the provision of IT services and the management of information, given the heavy reliance on technology in its operations and carrying out the park's day-to-day business. The key message is the need for the Park Authority at all levels to be aware of the increased cyber threat. Emphasis on good business continuity planning and a clear ICT strategy is important. I understand that the authority is looking to move to the Microsoft 365 platform to deliver services, and this does offer benefits, but given the vast range of potential options and configurations, caution is required to ensure that it's configured and maintained correctly, whilst providing the authority with the services and the benefits that it requires, but whilst also remaining in full control of your information assets. In the meantime, the housekeeping of current systems is vital to ensure that they remain secure from attack. Our review did come up with some recommendations regarding things like firewalls, system and device configuration, access control, malware protection, backups and business continuity, as well as things like patch management. Now that list sounds very long, but we've found no significant issues. They are just small things that, if our recommendations are implemented, should strengthen existing controls. And whilst we've been able to give reasonable assurance as an opinion on cybersecurity, given its importance and increasing risk, we will include some time in the current year's audit plan to assess progress made by officers in implementing those agreed actions. Overall, nothing that we found in our work warranted an entry in your annual governance statement, and I am able to give an overall opinion of reasonable assurance on the adequacy and effectiveness of the authority's internal control environment. So that's looking at last year. It's customary for me to take this opportunity to outline our plan for this year, this 22-23, and once again, this will consist of up to 23 days outlined in the table in paragraph 5.1 of the report in front of you. And we'll be undertaking the annual review of your key financial systems, a continuation of examining how the park goes about its governance and management of information following on from that cyber security review I've just talked about. And as already mentioned, we'll assess progress with the implementation of those agreed actions coming out of that review. I am in discussions with the Chief Finance Officer regarding further topics suitable for a high-level review, for which we have 3 days allocated and is indicated by to be confirmed in the report. I've examined your risk register and taken into account possible areas that could be considered and have provided the Chief Finance Officer with a short list. However, should any other areas come to light that officers and members consider as requiring a review by internal audit, then we're more than happy to undertake such work. At this stage, I'm happy to take questions before I go on to the audit charter and strategy at Appendix 2.
Thank you, Dominic. Any questions from members? Yeah, please, Marcus.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know whether it's a relevant question for now, because we talk about but what we was talking about the IT threat and the cyber threat was, I've always been of the opinion, who's going to be worried about little Exmoor National Park? Till I spoke to a local business who had to spend a mind-boggling amount of money rebuilding their systems. And is it a serious, in your opinion, is it a serious threat? And if it did happen, would it actually affect this organisation? I assume planning is all done online and however. And actually, if we did have to spend a significant amount of money rebuilding everything, where would it come from? I think that would be the question. I don't know whether that's a question for you or not. And I am just one quick one. I'd love to know what patch management is.
Right, thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Councillor. Taking on the final point about patch management. Patch management. Anybody who has, we've all got laptops, computers, whatever, at home, and when that dreaded thing where it says about a Windows update, that is a patch. It's the software companies issuing modifications for the coding because of either they're just updating coding just because to make it more efficient, or more generally because they're aware of a security loophole in their software that hackers and those that want to cause trouble have found and can then infiltrate into either the software or into your actual device. So patch management is basically managing all the updates, because we just have Windows to contend with, but your ICT department have all the systems, computer systems and software that you use as an authority. And patches come through quite on a regular basis, so it is a question of making sure that patches are applied as soon as they're received. So that's patch management. As far as the cyber threat, as you say, a national park, why would anybody attack a national park? You have to remember that these people, the other end of the on their laptops somewhere in the world, they'll attack as many organisations, it doesn't matter what size, just because they can. And just all it needs is to be successful at one, and it causes havoc, and B, there's a potential financial reward for them. So yes, a lot of people say, why me? But as you point out, a local small business might get hit, and yes, it does cause absolute disruption. There's been a number of cases reported with local authorities and other public sectors, including NHS, who have had cyber attacks. And it is costly, both in terms of money, time, and resource, to get everything back to normal. You can have in place plans, etc., and that's why we had recommendations about business continuity plans. But it is a serious threat to whatever. It doesn't matter what size organisation you are.
Thank you, Gordon. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I can mention a couple more points. So Dominic provided information on business continuity. So yes, I mean, when we do the risk management paper every year, we do talk briefly about business continuity. And so with every year that goes by, we try to make things a bit more robust. So in recent years, as you move to 365, the less that's managed locally in our servers and the more that's managed in the cloud, the more robust things are. The way we use our phones in the last couple of years has changed in that regard. But also we do have insurance that's in place. We do have backups. They are off-site. They are done on a regular basis. But also in that risk management paper, we also say that we accept the fact that if there was a major attack, then it would be a number of days that we would have to take to rebuild things. But we're not a life and limb service in that regard. So if for a week or so things were down, then that's something we accept. I'm a trustee for a secondary school, and they refer to having 100,000 attacks a month. So it is a fact of life, and other national parks have had serious breakdowns in their IT.
Thank you, Gordon. Christine first, and then
Change
Mike
of
Kelly.
subject. It's not the same subject, but earlier in the presentations you spoke about staff sickness. I just want to be clear that and be assured that the staff here do know the route through HR or whoever if they need help of any kind, because our staff are obviously really valuable to us, and sometimes everybody needs a bit of advice or help. So just to be assured that new staff in particular know the route in order to get any support. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon.
Yeah, Chair, that is part of our induction. So we always make sure that staff are aware of the various routes they can get for help and for the support lines that we operate. And it's also the fact it's more just this is a useful prompt that sometimes we do have a process whereby there's a return to work interview after every period of ill health, and it's just making sure that the time period between staff returning and to that interview, or it's not really an interview, but that sort of conversation happening, it's reminding us that we need to keep that gap down, because obviously that's the time where issues could be highlighted.
Thanks, Christine. And of course, that the person responsible is there to your right, Christine, for that role. So yeah, that's Ellie's role, and I'm sure she makes sure those processes are in place. Mike Kelly.
Can I just take you to paragraph 4.8, which talks about climate change. And it talks about the authority faces a significant challenge to make progress to net zero by 2030, along, I suspect, with virtually every other public authority. And then the paragraph says, in that regard, it would be useful to have a clear picture of the funding and projects that are needed to make the authority substantially carbon neutral by 2030. Now, we recognise the challenges, but we also recognise as an authority that we need to address this, and we do prioritise this. So it would be useful perhaps to have an update with regard to progress towards that target at some point.
Good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll feed that back and I'll make sure members do get an update. I mean, with specifically regard to 4.8 in the internal audit section there, I mean, obviously the authority set aside almost £100,000 into environmental resilience probably 2 or 3 years ago, and a lot of that's now been drawn down upon with the work that's been undertaken with the LED lights and with the secondary double glazing in parts of Exmoor House and those kind of things. So yes, I mean, there is going to be it is going to be a challenge to be able to top up that in the near future, but there's still a lot more projects that you know, that Claire Reid in particular is looking to push forward.
Thank you. And back to you, I think, Dominic.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. If we move on to the charter and the strategy, the public sector internal audit standards require us as Devon Audit Partnership to publish a charter and strategy each year. The charter sets out the purpose, the authority and responsibilities of your internal audit service that we provide, whilst the strategy outlines how that service will be delivered. And this is indicated in the index on the second page. This is the second year that I presented our new, what I call our new look interactive charter and strategy document, which I think is a far better than the old style report that you and our other DAP clients had received pre-pandemic. As far as the content of both is concerned, they were basically essentially the same as the document you approved last summer. But I will outline 2 changes. The only changes from last year are on slide 13 of the charter, entitled Quality Assurance and Improvement Programme, where we give the results of our latest 5-year public sector internal audit standard inspection, which took place last autumn. That was carried out by 2 heads of service from the home counties who came down for a few days and just examined all our processes, how we're set up. So basically, it's almost like the auditors being audited to a certain degree. But we're pleased to say that we retained our highest level of performance and category, which is very pleasing. And the other change is basically on slide 19 of the audit strategy, towards the end of the whole document, and that's the resources and skills, where we've updated staff details in light of various departures and new arrivals to the DAP team. As you will see, you know, we continue to have a good cross-section of skills, knowledge and qualifications, and I would like to highlight the 5 apprentices that we now have as DAP strives to develop the next generation of auditors, and also the fact that I'm not getting any younger. Apart from that, I don't propose to go through the document in any more detail, but I'm happy once again to take any questions.
Thank you. Members? There are no questions. Gordon, anything to add from you?
Nothing further from me, Chair.
And I assume, have you anything else to add, Dominic, on that item? At the
No, I think that's it, Chair. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much. Members, we have a recommendation to receive the internal audit report and charter and strategy and note the work programme plan for 2022-23. Can I have proposer Mike Ellicott, seconder Mike Kelly? Those in favour? So, everyone, thank you very much. And we will, those, please.
I was going to propose that the authority record its grateful thanks to Gordon Bryant for his excellent performance under very difficult conditions last year.
Thank you, Vivian. I'm sure that is supported by everyone in this room. Quick show of hands. Yeah, definitely. They are, Gordon. I think we'll record that, but thank you very much. And it is definitely quite good to see an audit report at this level that doesn't show us with an awful lot of shortcomings anywhere. So it is appreciated, Gordon and his department's work there. We will move on to item 7, the 2021-22 outturn, budget performance and reserves. Thank you, Dominic, very much for your attendance. And hand over to Gordon.
Thank you, Chair. So the outturn report for 22, along with a budget, are the two most important finance papers that are brought before the authority. And within it, there's a number of funding allocations or transfers within reserves that I'll be bringing to your attention as I go through. So the report begins with the introduction, explaining the funding that we got for 21-22 and how it is the cash limited as the same as from the last two financial years. The paper also describes how our budget is structured across the core budget, programmes and partnerships, and reserves. In 1.3, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact that in addition to the National Park grant, another £2 million worth of income was brought into the authority last year. That was from across a range of funding streams, including FIPL, interest, pinkery, planning, car parking, and all those sort of things. So a significant amount of money gets brought in addition to National Park grants. The COVID impact has reduced, but we still received 44,000 last year from directed from via local government, from central government, towards bouncing back within the national park centres and for pinkery. So section 2 is the core budget, and this refers to the ongoing sort of revenue costs of the authority providing those main services. There was a small underspend in year after the transfers between reserves. 2.4 mentions that another key part of the financial story for the last financial year is the Farming in Protected Landscapes programme. So even though it nets to zero within the core budget, it's still an important part of that story. So that was 281,000, and we of course actually overspent. We were able to seek additional funds because the panel and the local community were very good in bringing forward schemes that were deliverable and getting them delivered. And not all national parks did spend all their allocation, but we actually spent more than our allocation. In terms, 2.5 details some movements between spends. So there was an overspend within conservation and access, which includes woodlands within it, and that's for some of the external costs of clearing up woodlands after the storms. So a lot of work was done in-house, but some work was also externally done to get the rights of way open again. There was also small under and overspends within information and interpretation management, legal support, member and corporate management. The pay award, you'll recall, was very late this year, but it did manage to fall in within March, so the figures you see before you does include the pay award for the year. Section 3 includes fixed term programmes. This is the element of this is the opportunity to meet park purposes with external organisations and also with a small grant scheme. So significant issue to draw to your attention there is the fact that we found some additional funding to extend the Historic Buildings Officer post for another 12 months. Pinkery is a key point of attention. There's always the risks of a deficit arising within the Outdoor Education Centre. It's a quasi trading unit, but this year they did bounce back very, very well, and they only needed to draw down 10,000 from the money that was set aside for meeting deficits. Because obviously, when the pandemic first hit, we were careful to put aside money for the Outdoor Education Centre in the knowledge that that would be affected, and there was still significant losses from schools when they had to drop out due to outbreaks within the school. 3.5 also just mentions that this was the last year of the providing ongoing budget for the small grant scheme, and the relevant appendix to show the drawdowns from that scheme this year. Section 4 shows reserves, and this is a key way of understanding how the National Park plans and meets future obligations. There does show an increase from 2.8 million to 3.0 million. That in a sense flatters us because of course within the year as well we received some significant money from legacies. So later on in the report I do describe the movement in reserves when those one-offs are stripped out. So 4.4 shows the capital spend that we've undertaken in this year. So there was 53,000 on the visitor facilities at Ashcombe. Half of Exmoor House that had double glazing has since had secondary double glazing. We've almost completed the car park improvement works at the Valley of Rocks. We've had the retentions bill at White Rock Cottage, and also there's over £50,000 worth of spend on the establishment of By Wood, which is externally funded. 4.5 just mentions that there's been a large amount of spend in woodlands generally this year. So it's a lot to do with ash dieback and the clearance of the winter storms, but it's also by common and the grey squirrel work as well. So for us, that's an awful lot of money to spend on woodlands, and that's a key part of the story for last year. 4.6 details some of the other movements in reserves that is being suggested or recommended as part of this outturn paper. So there's the allocations from Caremore. So you'll see that left in the Caremore reserve at the end of the year is 460,000, 450 of which relates to the legacy payments, and 10,000 of which for conservation. And the first bullet point details these other movements in Caremore. So now that County Gate, the situation has been finalised, there was 60,000 left in the reserve that's no longer required, so that's been transferred to general balances in the first instance. We're also transferring a bit more money to Development Management Reserve to meet some of the one-off costs of consultants. There's money to extend the funding officer post until the end of the current financial year. And also we've established a Capital Development Reserve for the first time. So this comes from, we've had £100,000 sat in capital receipts for a while, and so rather than just leaving it sat there and waiting for a dream project, we thought, but at the same time, alongside this, we have ad hoc capital spend that happens in the year that's funded from revenue. So rather than keeping funding capital spend from revenue and have capital receipts left, we instead chose to apply some of that capital receipts to the capital spend, and the money that was going to fund that capital spend from the reserve pots has instead gone into the Capital Development Reserve. Apologies if that sounds a little bit complicated, but basically it means now that we've got the capital receipt pot is now a reserve, and it can be used to fund spend that may be revenue or maybe capital. And the purpose of the Capital Development Reserve is to facilitate capital spend. So there may be items of spend on assets such as driver farm or car parks that may cut across revenue and capital, but now it's treated as revenue. We can apply it to those spends. We also just mentioned the current position of general balances, which is healthy, and then 4.8 goes on to talk about the level of reserves. So even though our reserves has gone up, the headline figure has gone up over the course of this financial year, the table in 4.8 actually shows the movement of reserves since the end of March 2015. So you can see the transfer down from 3.6 million of reserves from 2.5 billion reserves when you strip out the legacy money and the Capital Development Reserve, so those one-offs. So I think we're quite clear that even though it feels that we have a very healthy level of reserves, in actual fact there is a clear trend, and we do have to be mindful of the extent to which we're drawing down on reserves to meet ongoing costs. You may remember from a month or two ago when external auditors came, they were asking that we begin the process of doing in-year monitoring on a quarterly basis. So Section 5 actually just details some of our actual spend against outturn. If there was any clear trends arising at this point in time, this would be the opportunity that I would draw them to your attention. Of course, at month 2, at the end of month 2, it's very difficult to get any real pattern or trend that's arising in the financial year, but we're sort of meeting that obligation by formally introducing some quarterly monitoring. We're also now obliged to show quarterly monitoring for prudential indicators. This relates to our borrowing, if we had any, but we don't have any, so it's relatively straightforward. And then Section 7 as well. I thought it was important for me today to also update you on the MTFP. So when we set the budget in March, there was an expectation of getting, or there was an assumption built into it that we would get National Park grant increases in year 2 and 3 of the MTFP. We've now been informed that that's almost certainly not going to be the case. So what the table does in 7.3 is just highlight the latest savings gap when you factor in the non-receipt of those increases in National Park grant in those 2 financial years. So you can see that we've still got a balanced budget for the current year, no problem there. We're still assuming that the pay award is 2%. So if the pay award is 2%, we've got a balanced budget. But obviously for the next 2 financial years, what was relatively doable and relatively the savings gap, to achieve on an incremental basis, it suddenly appears much more significant. So I just need to be quite clear that there is going to be a process that's going to be put in place in order to meet these savings gaps. So we'll be looking to reintroduce the Finance and Performance Advisory Panel, and possibly September is the time when we'll be doing that. And there will be a body of work to set balanced budgets, and it will be a challenge to continue to provide our existing level of service. So those are the key points from me.
Thank you, Gordon. John Petrinos.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the body of the report about the outturn is great. I mean, it shows a whole raft of achievements given done under challenging circumstances, and it's really sort of very encouraging about how the authority can perform. My main concern is about the tiny paragraph at the end about the budget gap for the future. And even though it's bad, I'm kind of surprised it's not even worse, given that we've got a no real terms cash settlement for many years from the government. We've got inflation that's kind of at least doubled since we set the budget. There's a pay claim in for 11.1%, I believe, and which would just kind of knock a hole in the whole thing. There's clearly fuel has gone through the roof, and it seems to me that this £250,000 odd quid can only get worse. Is that? Am I right?
Gordon?
There are lots of pressures that could make it worse. Yes, so we've got rental income, and there's a lot of pressure on rental income at the moment. The land that we hold in hand and the land that we don't hold in land, there's a lot of pressures there. There's also a pensions funds valuation that will hit into our budgets as from the 1st of April next year, and of course the staff pay awards, which is absolutely huge, obviously in terms of the impact. The non-staff items that you list. I think we just need to bear in mind that such a high proportion of our costs is staff costs, that a lot of the focus is in reality on the staff pay award. And the assumption within the MTFP was 2% for the next 3 years. That could be, well, it's going to be wrong, but it could be very wrong, because in reality life is more complicated than that. So yes, there's a continual process of adapting, but we are starting to work through a list of options, and there are incremental changes that we'll be bringing before you before too much longer. And also, there may be sort of broader changes as well.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you have an idea off the top of your head what the difference would be to the budget if the pay award were 3% instead of 2%, or 4% instead of 3%? What's a 1% additional increase in staff pay going to? What damage is it going to do to the budget?
About £22,000 per 1%.
Thank you, Gordon. I think that it's highlighting actually at the moment that we do have a level of certainty, and that is that we're not going to get any more money, and it's not going to be indexed linked to inflation at the moment for the 3 years. But that just does highlight the level of concern over that service provision that's likely to be possible in the future, and how we've got to look very carefully at how the authority works. Dominic.
Thank you. Thanks, Gordon. Excellent report as usual. I'm interested that the paragraph near the beginning about the balance between the amount that comes from the DEFRA grant and the amount that comes from external funding or external sources. So some of that I know is commercial income, but some of that is also grant income, or things like FIPL or other activities whereby in that external funding a portion of that can be allocated to management fees. We've talked about this before with the external funding group and how we can do more on that front. And because it seems to me that the trend could well be towards national parks being expected to increasingly derive their income from external sources rather than the grant. And natural capital being used as one of the I'm not quite sure what you call it, but sort of cover terms to kind of justify that, as it were. So I'm just interested whether we've done any sort of scenario planning. I mean, I'm interested in looking backwards and forwards, actually. One, I'm interested, but this is purely out of interest, and you might already have this somewhere, about how that ratio has changed over the last 10 years. You've done this interesting thing about what's happened to the reserve since 2013. It'd be interesting to see what's happened to our ratio of DEFRA grant versus external funding over that same period of time. And the other thing is then to predict what actually could happen over the next 5 to 10 years, and how we would need to restructure financially if we were to be able to have to get more of the core costs, so core staff costs, some of them, and this could be rangers, it could be people working in conservation and development and things like that, could actually increasingly see increasing percentages of their cost covered by external sources. So that means using basically external funding and then allocating costs basically from our core budget, which of course requires a reshuffling of how that budget actually works. So sorry, that's a little bit muddled. But have you done that sort of scenario planning, or are you intending to?
Well, in terms of the financial the financial approach that I've always undertaken is within the core budget, it's got core ongoing funding to be matched against it. So what the budget won't show you, but this will, is the amount of other costs that have fallen that have been externally funded. But it's certainly very interesting. You think there's quite a lot of recruitment that's going along at the minute, and it's nearly all project-based. So you can see that's in Woodlands, that's Ennis, that's all sorts of things. Probably, well, we don't get much turnover in the core budget anymore, but certainly it's nearly all sort of project-based. So to tie back to exactly what you said, I think there is an increased awareness from funding bodies that they have to give you something for admin and management. I don't know if that fully, truly ever works through in reality. I mean, you think of FIPL, you know, they were quite good about leaving money to a side, but none of that has gone towards Alex's costs, for example. It's all external costs that's come through. But what it does mean is that we need to leave money back within the core budget for the research, the preparation, and the bidding process, which is a huge job in its own right, and it's having that capacity and having those skills. So making sure we always leave something aside in the core budget so that we can have those projects ready to go.
Thank you, Gordon. Marcus.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies, I just found my biscuits. I thought I was going mad. I thought, sure, honey, they're on the floor down there, so if you see me crawl under a table later, you know why. Yeah, it was really about 4.6 in the Capital Development Reserve, and apart from asking you to, can you say all that again, please? I'm assuming, just for clarification, you're talking about capitalising, or not capitalising, I suppose revenuising things that are directly related to capital spend. Is that what? So, yeah.
This is a low risk, in accountancy terms, it's a low risk way of washing between capital and revenue, if you like. So that makes it sound scary, but it's not at all. You know, it's basically saying, as a matter of course, in most local authorities, they use capital resources to fund capital spend. We generally don't, because we don't generally have any capital resources. We generally use revenue resources to fund capital spend. But we had this £100,000 that was sat to one side, and rather than sort of leave it there and wait for the perfect project to apply it to, it makes more sense and it will provide greater utility if we bring it within the reserve body where it can be applied on lots of different things. So we've swapped. So where we had revenue funding that was going to fund capital, we funded it from capital, that capital receipts pot instead, and we applied then the money and the reserve that was going to be used to fund the capital spend has instead gone into the capital development reserve.
You also mentioned about pressure on rental income. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, we get over £300,000 a year from the estate. So where we have land in hand, that's either BPS or HLS or one of these type of issues. And also we have land that's farmed with tenants, and they're under pressure as well, because obviously their BPS is going down enormously, and there's a question mark over their other support as well. So there's a pressure there in terms of rent reviews, and the money will be getting in directly.
Eric?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the point John made regarding inflation, that obviously is going to potentially blow a lot of budgets out of the water at present and for the foreseeable future. But you know, remembering back when inflation was rampant in the early 80s, I cannot really recall it jumping at the rate they are now, but that's probably my memory. But the word I wanted to mention, which could have a big impact one way or another here, and I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention this word yet, is the word driver. Is it permissible to explore the impact that could have at this stage, or is that not? Is that too sensitive a word to mention?
No, not at all. So there's already 50,000 that the authority has set aside for work at Driver Farm, and we just had an update internally.
I'm thinking more along the line, depending on what decision is made on that. You know, the obvious one, if it is for open market sale, obviously that would have a big impact on things. And I'm not sure it's a question whether it applies to local authorities. For instance, does capital gains tax come into play for local authorities on such a sale? only you're potentially talking about a big sum of money that how it pans out could have a big impact on your bottom line here. That's Gordon.
Yeah, but it has a number of impacts, both in terms of the initial costs we have to find for whatever we do with Driver Farm. So even if we do, it's always going to cost something, and it will cost quite a lot depending on the other options that we may take. There's no capital gains tax in local authorities, so we would be free to do anything we wanted with it in terms of the proceeds of it, as long as it was for capital purposes. And we are mindful of the fact that there's a very real possibility that for a period of time we will be getting less income against it, because for almost certainly for a period of time it won't be tenanted. But of course, I think to get a one-off, I mean, we don't want to get too much into that debate, but the one-off proceeds would be handy, but it's still money we need for ongoing services. That's the focus, and that's the single most important thing. But I suppose the most key issue for us with Driver at the moment financially is just making sure that there's money set aside for those immediate costs. So the authority has already set aside 50,000, and the next opportunity to revisit that will be November. I mean, yesterday we had an update, and there's a number of surveys that have been undertaken on asbestos and structural surveys, water supply, and lots of other things. And there is immediate work that does have to be undertaken, no matter what course the authority takes with it.
Thank you, Gordon. I think that's highlighted some of the potential costs, especially around the infrastructure that's there anyway. But bearing in mind I'm a kind of glass half full sort of person normally, we also have quite a significant estate otherwise. And although there is potentially a reduction in direct rental income there are also an awful lot of opportunities coming forward that we need to explore beyond the direct payment or direct grant on the longer term management. But I'm sure will be there, things like green environment network, that type of thing, which can be added in. There are an awful lot as we move forward that I would hope there are opportunities we can capitalise on that will directly contribute both to budget and to national park purposes. Mike.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just picking up on that point, I suspect a lot of what we've been talking about has been anticipated in the our friend the Landscapes Review, in terms of the move away from the central DEFRA funding towards being more entrepreneurial and using our assets more and looking at external funding. So I suspect that we're being driven into this scenario that's been anticipated at a more wider picture with the Landscapes Review. So it's as well to be, I think, aware of that general landscape, and what we're doing presumably is in response to our own concerns, but also perhaps to a driver out there which is saying, look guys, you've got to move towards being far more business-like in the way that you're dealing with things. You've got to use your assets far more. You've got to look at external funding. You've got to look at partnership opportunities, working with other authorities and other businesses. So I suspect that's what we're doing anyway, but it does seem to align with what was coming out of the Landscapes Review. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, that's certainly a broader trend. I mean, the Landscape Review also talked about us getting, certainty of funding and inflation-linked increases as well. And it talked about the aspirations to do lots and lots of things which have never had a funding source available to them. But yeah, and certainly DEFRA have found money recently to support some of those projects via National Parks partnerships. So you can see that implementation. It just doesn't necessarily benefit us directly at the moment.
Thank you. And I think I'd refer back what we have in this report, refer back to the previous item in the report from our audit partnership, which recognises the level of activity and actions that are taking place here. Actually, so I think it's an ongoing process. Any other questions? Gordon, have you got anything to add? Members, list of. Oh, sorry, Jeremy.
I'd simply like to move the recommendations, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Can I have a seconder? Vivian? And all those in favour? Thank you very much, members. Everyone, Judy, thank you. And we will move on. Our Gordon's there in his seat to item 8, the Annual Treasury Management Report.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So 7.2 is the draft statement of accounts. So this is now on our internet and it's open for...
Oh, sorry. I was on item... Sorry, Gordon. I was still on item 7.
Yes, so this is the draft statement of accounts. So this is available on the internet at the moment, and the public inspection period has begun, and it's with the auditors, and they have begun to ask questions. So it's very much in the draft stages, and if there are any material changes to this, this will be brought back before the authority, but it will be approved by the final accounts committee. I don't plan to go through this in page by page. There's quite a lot there. There aren't any structural changes to it or technical accounting changes that I need to draw your attention to. You'll probably be familiar with the narrative report that starts on page 3, and that has a useful narrative introduction to financial performance, to what the statements contain, and to our key performance indicators. And it also has some sort of headlines in terms of the outturn for the year. So that shows the people funds, for example, and the amount spent on woodlands, for example. In terms of other issues to draw your attention to within the accounts, I mean, there's the balance sheet. So the accounting definition of the pension fund deficit has gone down by 1.8 million. The value of assets has gone up by around £500,000. But other than that, there's no sort of real key pointers to draw your attention to. I wouldn't have said. The accounts is structured in terms of the primary financial statements, then the accounting policies, and then also, of course, there's the various notes to the accounts that detail the balance sheet, for example, or pension, or the cash flow statements, and the movement in reserves and those sort of things. So it's also got the draft annual governance statement in, and which is right at the end. And the intention was that this would go before the Standards Committee before it gets in the draft accounts. Obviously, that wasn't possible this year. So if the Standards Committee does come back with any changes, then we may still feed that through to the annual governance statement in its final form. But those are the key points, Chair.
Thank you, Gordon. Any questions? In which case, I wonder whether someone would like to move. Thank you, Stephen. Moved. Seconded, Mike Kelly. All those in favour? Thank you very much, members. And now, Gordon, can move on to item 8.
So yeah, so this report sort of summarises our compliance with the authority's treasury management policies and operations for the year that was established back in March 2021. It's interesting, people were talking about inflation, but of course this shows the flip side of inflation. So of course, over the course of the old financial year, base rates went from 0.1% to 1.25%. So that's a significant increase from an extremely low base. It also shows in 3.2.13 the total income for the year from interest. So that was just under 9,000. Now, when I started, it was around 30,000 a year we were getting in interest. So this is far and away the least we've ever got by some gap. And it's also interesting to speak to colleagues from SCC, but there was a time when we were getting over 5% on our interest. So that would have been a total interest of around £150,000, £160,000 a year the authority would have been getting in on interest, which is kind of depressing, but there we go. But obviously, in terms of the flip side of inflation, we will see interest going up over the next few years. So that's worth bearing in mind as well at the same point. But in terms of the key sort of governance issues within the paper, this shows how, because we lend our money to SEC who lend it out on our behalf, and this shows the terms within which they lend out and who they lend to. It describes a little bit about the economic background. It shows our compliance with prudential indicators over the course of the last financial year. So those are the key points from it.
Thank you, Gordon. Members, any questions of Gordon? Nick, right.
I was just interesting that I thought the government started to change whereby the authorities couldn't lend out of their area. Is that something you're aware of? Because we lend to Somerset County Council, yes, and I just was under the impression that they were bringing in some tighter regulations that enabled, or to give an example, Somerset West and Taunton can only lend, or can only invest, should I say, within their own area. They can't invest outside. At the moment, I believe they can invest in Cornwall, if you like, but I thought there was coming in with restrictions on that. Is there any news on that side?
No, I'm not aware of that. I mean, the Markets in Financial Instruments Directive came in a few years back, which very much minimised the level of places you could lend to for the non-professionals. So for people like us, it tied our hands very much in terms of our ability to undertake our own treasury management. So which reinforced the need to stay with the professional services offered by others. But no, I'm not aware. I mean, there is a policy that's operated in terms of who they invest to and under what circumstances. But I'm not aware that we're limited in that regard.
Go on, Francis Nicholson.
I'm sure you're right, Gordon. I think the thing was that that local authorities are now not supposed to invest elsewhere, like not buying buildings in Birmingham if you happen to be in Cornwall. And that's what it's about, rather than who actually handles our cash.
Yeah, and there's a lot more restrictions. So to invest for purely commercial purposes has got more difficult for local authorities and for national parks, effectively. But national parks are always a bit more restricted there in that regard, anyway. But it's now the case. But this is more about the investment of cash rather than capital investment decisions, which is slightly separate.
Thank you, Gordon. Any further questions? Can I ask someone move the? Thank you, Stephen. Seconder. Jeremy, absolutely. Those in favour? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Gordon. Definitely your morning here this morning, Gordon, isn't it? As we move on to item 9, the Members' Allowances Scheme. Gordon.
Yes, so thank you, Chair. So this is the report on expenses that are paid to you all over the course of the last financial year. That obviously include the basic allowance, the special responsibility allowances, and payments that were made to you to support your travel. It's an operation of the policy that was agreed back in March 2021. It does include the pay award, so that just crept into the last financial year as well, so that makes it quite a bit more straightforward. So that was the 2%. The only other thing to mention is that, of course, numbers are still very low because there's much less mileage that's being claimed than before the pandemic. But it's a fairly factual report. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions, members? And I have a recommendation. Mike Kelly, moved by Mike Kelly, seconded John Petrinos. Those in favour? Thank you very much, members. And thank you, Gordon, very much. We'll move on to item 10, and the Exmoor Consultative and Parish Forum, and hand over to Mike Ellicott. Mike.
Hello, fellow members. This is a report on the meeting of, where are we to? It was the March meeting. It's a report on the March meeting, not the recent meeting that we had at Withypool. And that one will be reported on possibly on the next meeting. A very good meeting. We were very light on agenda items, but it didn't help matters when Southwest Distribution Manager for Western Power didn't come along, and that was one of the items that were missing. But everything else went very well. A very, very interesting report by Dan Barnett on the family-friendly cycle trails, which I found was very interesting and quite exciting, what's being produced there. And then we had Sarah do a update on the Glover report, review the landscapes review, and that again was very interesting. I don't know how up to date it will be in the future with the way things are changing dramatically, but we will see. I think everything's changed since the Glover report in the world with the food security and everything else, but we have to work with what we've got. So I don't know if there's any questions on it, but it was quite a
Members?
condensed meeting.
Members, any questions? Please, Marcus.
Thank you. Did EDF then, did they turn up for the June meeting? No. So, I mean, it is quite a concern, isn't it? Because, it is quite a concern, isn't it? Because, you speak to lots of people and, we're trying to encourage people into electric cars, but actually there's not the power network to do them if they want to go at home. And it's a problem that's going to only get worse, I think, and I'm wondering what the solution is or how much pressure we can put on EDF or Western Power. I mean, there's other power issues, as we all know about. An awful lot of power getting generated in the peninsula, but not necessarily getting to the right places. It does seem a shame that we're quite close to the peninsula, and we seem to have a problem where, if you're living in, I don't know, Begging Hewish, you might struggle to suddenly get the power you need to charge an electric car, let alone get three-phase in your house. And I wonder, whether it's going to, how much pressure, or whether that conversation should be started. That said, we've been looking at broadband for years and years, and before you know it, Starlink could be here and the problem will be solved. Please God, thank you.
Thank you. Points are noted. Definitely. Christine Lawrence.
Yes, I just want to point out a couple of things about cycle tracks, which are very popular, and I've had a lot of dealings with maintenance of cycle tracks, and it worries me slightly that it's not just the building of a cycle track, it's the maintenance of it in the longer term which can become a problem. So I don't want to spoil anything, but I just want us to be careful about plans for the future and to be assured that we, if we're involved in something, have got that under a review. The maintenance of it is quite usually, as I have found out, extraordinarily expensive to get cycle tracks to the level that they need to be and kept at the level that they need to be. So I'm not trying to be anti at all, but positive in the fact that we need to be thinking about the long-termness of this type of, which is what everybody loves to do, but it just costs money.
I think, Christine, yes, that's point well made, and I think it's something we've got to be very well aware of with any of these projects, that whenever it's put in place, you're right, it has to be run from then on. And particularly pertinent, I think we're finding with an awful lot of those public services on other authorities at the moment. If there are no other questions on that, then please note the next meeting has noted here has already happened, and you will have a report in due course. So rather than venture into anything that was discussed there, we'd better move on there, Mike, into danger of repeating things. So thank you very much, member. We are asked to, I can't remember what we're asked to do, just to note, receive and note that meeting. Please, you have done so. Move on, item 11, a personnel update. We have two leavers. Josephine Bradford, Funding Development and Project Development Officer, and Elsa Stevens, our Comms Officer. So, and two starters actually, a fixed-term contract for Robin Offer, which is a name for any of you who've been here, you will have seen a time or two there, and Andrew Laws as Rural Surveyor from mid-August. Please.
I just wondered if we, without reaching any confidences, if we could be told why Elsa Stevens is leaving, because I thought she was a very good appointment and a big success in the job.
She was excellent. The problem is she was too good. And go on, Sarah.
Yeah, Elsa's been an absolute star. She's a brilliant member of staff, and we're very, very sad to see her go. However, Elsa has thought really long and hard about future in that sort of media world and PR and comms, and decided she wanted to go back to really where her heart is, which is a more scientific role, and she's moving to the NHS, where she's going to be working with cancer patients.
So, yes, very disappointed to lose Elsa, and I think, yeah, to definitely record our thanks to both Josephine and then particularly to Elsa, who's been a very visible face for the authority for recent years. I have not been notified of any other business of urgency, so at that point I'll thank members and declare the authority meeting closed.